Good day, Canada. Good evening, Asia. It's Thursday, 12 p.m. in Toronto, and it's time for our regular webinar on immigration to Canada. My name is Alex Davidson, and today we'll return to the previously discussed topic about temporary visas to Canada. As we have already mentioned, it's much more difficult to receive a Canadian temporary visa than to receive a visa to any European country or even a visa to the United States. Canada is very serious about its visitors, and the process of applying for a TRV temporary resident visa to Canada is not very straightforward. Probably this is because in the United States or in European countries, compared to Canada, you cannot stay legally just coming here or there on a temporary visa. In Canada, you can do that under certain conditions, of course, but there is always a way to transform your temporary resident visa in Canada into the legal immigration pathway. So today we'll explain one important part of the process. We'll show you how to draft a good invitation letter required if you're going to visit your friends or your relatives in Canada. At the end of this webinar, we'll give you the download link to the professionally written invitation letter that you can use as your own sample to create your own invitation. It is absolutely free and has been created deliberately for you. So stay tuned. First of all, let me remind you that there is only one type of temporary visa to Canada compared to other countries, where, say, for example, in Europe, you can get guest visas, business visas, tourist visas, etc. In Canada, we have only one. Things are very simple here. It is called TRV or Temporary Resident Visa to Canada. We're not talking today about foreign workers or students in Canada who also have to apply for work permits or study permits. Any other visitor has to apply for the same type of visa regardless of the purpose of his or her visit. However, the purpose of the planned visit determines what documents are to be enclosed with the application. For example, an individual who wishes to visit Canada for tourism purposes, he or she has to provide trip itinerary, including hotel bookings, cities he or she is planning to visit, and so on and so on. An individual who's going to visit Canada with a business trip, on the other hand, has to provide other documents such as invitation from a business partner, proof of business activities, etc. And if you're going to come to Canada to stay for a while with your friends, with your family who lives in Canada, one of the mandatory supporting documents is the letter of invitation. So let's see what it is. A letter of invitation, it is a document prepared by the inviting party, not by you, by somebody who lives in Canada and who invites you to come to Canada for some time. There are certain requirements to be taken into consideration when drafting an invitation letter, and we'll touch upon them in a few minutes. Obviously, the invitation must be written in English or French, not any other language. The invitation serves as a simple purpose. It provides an immigration officer with the essential information about the proposed visit. If some important information is missing in the invitation, an officer, he or she, may refuse an application just because this officer does not have full understanding of the situation. And this reason is sufficient to make a negative decision. I hope this explains you why this webinar and why having a draft invitation letter is essential for the whole application. So before we proceed to the invitation letter itself, let's briefly clarify who is entitled to invite a visitor to Canada. A common misconception is that only a Canadian citizen or permanent resident can invite a friend or a relative to Canada. It is not quite so. People who are here with the temporary status can also invite others to visit them. For example, that's by the way a very common example. A foreign student who is studying in Canada could invite his or her parents to spend winter holidays together. Another example with the students' convocation ceremony, and lots of foreign students are trying to invite their parents, their relatives, to join them on the convocation ceremony here in Canada. With a temporary foreign worker, another example could be that he or she, the temporary worker, could invite his or her spouse and kids to visit for a few weeks. Actually, even a regular temporary resident, the person who resides temporarily in Canada on a regular basis, can invite another individual to Canada. There is absolutely no legal limitation to do this. However, let's be honest, it's not a very common scenario. Just because temporary visitors usually do not stay in Canada long enough to go through the whole process of inviting anybody else. And usually they're not established in Canada to be considered as an inviting party. However, as we said, there are a couple of examples where this situation could be applicable as well. So getting back to the document itself, what an invitation letter must contain. Essential information which has to be included in the letter of invitation is as follows. Information about an inviting party. Sometimes they are called a host. Information about the visitor who is being invited to Canada, right? So if they're inviting you, it should be information about you, who you are, what is the relationship between you. That's the third point, right? Are they friends? Are they relatives? How long do they know each other? How often do you meet? Everything that may help an officer to better understand the situation. Information about the planned visit, dates, locations, accommodation details, and so on and so on. Now, we'll explain this one by one. Details about the inviting party. Full name and date of birth. Very simple. Address of residence in Canada and full context, including phone, including email. An inviting party may be contacted by an immigration officer to verify application details, if it is required, of course. So all the contact information in Canada should be included. Information about your employment, job title, name of the employer, period of employment, employment income. This is necessary to assess if an inviting party is financially established and is able to provide support to the guest if such support is required for some reason. Here is a brief example. Say, permanent resident is inviting his or her relatives to visit in Canada, sometimes parents, for example. And the inviting party says that he or she would accommodate mother and father during their period of stay in Canada. Obviously, this inviting party has to provide enough information about his or her employment status, about the salary, about the regular income of the family to prove to the officer that the inviting party would be able to accommodate the invitee. Of course, last but not least, inviting party's status in Canada, whether he or she is a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident or a foreign student or a temporary foreign worker. This all has to be supported by an appropriate document. Just make sure that you include a copy of a Canadian passport or of a PR card or a copy of a study or work permit, if that is applicable. Just remember, only a person residing in Canada legally can invite a guest from abroad. We had a situation a couple weeks ago when we were asked if a person with a permanent resident status residing right now in Bangladesh can invite me to come to Canada. Generally, the answer is no, simply because he or she does not reside in Bangladesh, does not reside in Canada right now. Going further, details about the visitor. So the basic information about the guest is very simple. An invitation must include his or her full name, a date of birth, address and contact details in the guest's home country. So the guest who is also an applicant asking to issue a temporary visa to Canada may also be contacted by CIC, Citizenship and Immigration Canada officer with inquiries if further clarification is needed. Therefore, just make sure to provide full up-to-date contact information of the guest. And of course, this information must match the information provided in the TRV temporary resident visa application by an applicant him or herself. Otherwise, an officer will have a just ground to believe that the information in front of him or her is misleading, right? Typical mistake. The invitation letter says that I am inviting my friend or my relative ABCD who is residing here and here in that country. This is the phone number. And at the same time, the questionnaire form submitted to the officer by an applicant has another phone number. Maybe it's two different cell phone numbers. Maybe it's a home number, landline, and a cell number. Just this fact could be enough for the officer to consider the information misleading and could lead to the visa rejection. So be very careful with that. You will also have to clearly explain what is your relationship to the person being invited. It's not actually sufficient to pick up a random person, to write his or her name and date of birth in the invitation letter, those inviting the person to Canada. There should be some sort of relationship with the inviting party, and this relationship must be clearly described in the letter of invitation. So the person inviting you has to tell the officer if the guest is brother or sister, a parent, a cousin, an aunt or niece. It could be a schoolmate, could be a close friend. For the relative, of course, you should also include the proof of relationship, a birth certificate or any other documents, or even several documents, allowing an officer to trace family relationship between the inviting party and the guest. Now we go to the very important aspect of the invitation, details about the visit. Really lots of TRV applications, they get refused just because applicants do not pay much attention to this, assuming, for example, that being a brother or an uncle of Canadian citizen is sufficient reason by itself to be allowed to Canada. No, this is a big mistake, and this is of course not so. For an applicant to be approved, there must be a clear reason for a proposed visit. If no reason is stated in the application, it will most likely be refused. Now, speaking about the reason, I believe we covered them in the previous temporary resident visa webinars, but I can give you a couple of examples. So, for example, a brother from Bangladesh is willing to visit a brother in Canada. Is it obvious? In fact, no, it's not. In any case, even if the reason looks obvious to you, it might be explicitly present in the application. Talking about the letter of invitation, here are a few promised examples how a reason for a visit could be described or justified. For example, a person invites a brother after years of separation to show him or her Greater Toronto Area, Niagara Falls in Canada, Ottawa, and Montreal. You, you could be invited as an uncle or niece to a wedding in Canada. It could be an invitation to a mother-in-law to help during the first months after a baby was born in the family in Canada. It could be an invitation to grandparents so they can spend some time with their grandchildren in Canada. All of those above are examples of the reasons for a visit, even though some look too obvious. Just remember this message. Even obvious things must be explicitly included in the paperwork, right? It's not the officer's job to guess or to look at those things like you're looking at them. I'm a brother, I'm a relative of somebody in Canada, so this would be enough for me to come in. No, no, and no. Next, the dates of the visit. An invitation must include specific dates when a guest is going to come to Canada and, of course, when he or she is going to leave Canada. Duration and dates of stay must be reasonable in the scope of the visit reason. For example, you cannot invite a friend for a wedding for a 3 month visit. It is just simply unreasonable, and CIC officers, they trust me, they pay much attention to such details. 1 or 2 weeks for, say, for a wedding celebration, even for preparation, is okay. But 3 months is obviously too much, even for a big wedding. Even for Kardashian's wedding, that is too much. If the dates are flexible, simply mention that. For example, I am inviting my sister for 2 weeks from September 14th to September 28th, or on other dates this fall at her convenience. That is absolutely normal to say that. An officer has also get complete understanding of where a guest will live and how his or her expenses in Canada will be paid. Usually, an inviting party welcomes a guest to stay at his or her home. It is obvious, but once again, nonetheless, it has to be explained explicitly in the invitation letter. In most cases, a simple statement that a guest will be staying at the host house is fully sufficient. And also important, of course, the financial aspect of the trip. So every visit incurs expenses. At least two-way flight and basic expenses in Canada has to be somehow covered. An officer who would be reading your application must understand who is paying for the visit and for what. There are just two general scenarios. Expenses might be covered by a guest or by an inviting party. Within the scope of our webinar today, we'll just mention that if an inviting party is going to pay for all or for some of the guest's expenses, this, of course, must be clearly stated in the invitation letter. Besides, in this case, the inviting party must include documentary to support his or her ability to pay, such as a recent bank statement, employment income reference, and so on and so on. Concluding our talk about the invitation letter, we'll briefly touch upon questions we're often asked. The most frequently asked is the question if the invitation letter must be notarized. The answer is no. There is no such requirement that the invitation letter should be notarized or declared in the form of a sworn affidavit or something alike. It is just a formal letter signed by its author. No further legalization or notarization is required. Is it necessary to include original invitation letter with the application? This question actually applies only to the application submitted on paper. Since nowadays most TRV applications are filed electronically, it's obvious that an invitation must necessarily be original, scanned image for electronic submission. Or it could be a photocopy for paper-based submission. It is absolutely okay. So no original is required. Some people also asked if it's allowed to write an invitation from, for example, two people. The answer is yes, it is possible, and in some situations, it is also the only reasonable option. For example, an individual is wishing to invite his or her mother to Canada, and this individual is unemployed at the moment. This is not very good in the eyes of an immigration officer because unemployment means absence of monthly income, and limited ability to support the invited guest in Canada. In this situation, it is advisable to draft an invitation from a family, given that the individual spouse is employed. Even though for a spouse the guest is not a close relative, it could be beneficial simply because that the spouse is working. So in this case, the invitation would be written from two persons and signed by two persons. And it is absolutely normal. After all is said today, you may be under impression that a good invitation letter that a document is a document which is hard to write. Be patient, and as I promised, I will provide you that everything you learned today can result in a nice one-page document with, which meets all requirements and gives all the answers to all important questions. Before you actually download the sample and start drafting your own, please remember, the invitation letter is not just a formality. It is a simple mark in the document's checklist. But this simple mark should be carefully reviewed and will be carefully reviewed by an immigration officer, and the final decision in the application will 100% depend on it. Now you could proceed to the link shared in comments. You can use the link in this slide. I will also share it on the Google+. It will also be available in the recorded video on YouTube. And you can use this free sample to build your own invitation document. But just remember, there are many, many other aspects of TRV applications that require your attention. We covered most of those in the previous webinars, but if you need assistance, simply let us know. I'm always actually finishing webinars with one note. Please come to us if you have questions about visas and immigration to Canada. We are conducting these free presentations not to make you run and apply for a visa to Canada immediately. No. The purpose is very simple, and you know it better than us. Too many so-called quote-to-quote agents are defrauding people in Asia every day, promising quote-to-quote guaranteed immigration to our country. We are here to raise awareness and to teach you all how to apply carefully and how to avoid fraud. You may always count on us and receive free advice and consultation from us and our partners in Bangladesh, Visa Center. We work with them every day to make your dreams of Canada a reality. So feel free to come in, use our direct contacts in Bangladesh and in Canada for your benefit. Your likes on Facebook, +1 on Google+, are also much appreciated. They help us to see that you support further talks and development of these webinars. Next time, we will talk about family sponsorship in Canada, and we will discuss how you can bring your family to Canada with you. So stay tuned with us, and on this note, thank you all for listening. Goodbye.